You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren, and I am the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. And with me today, I have Kristen Fitzgerald, who's a new hire in our Governmental Relations Department. And I'm so excited to have her on the podcast because we're going to be talking about her and her life experiences and what got her to the Illinois Association of School Boards and what we can expect through her work here. So, Kristen, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat. I'm very excited about this new chapter working for ISB and excited to get to know everyone.
Yeah, same here. So let's just dive right in. So you were formerly a school board member. So could you tell me what inspired you to first run to be on your local school board, and maybe what were some of the more meaningful moments during your time as a school board member?
Sure. Yes. I love being at ISB because I love school board members so much. Yes, I was one. I ran for school board in 2013. There were some discussions going on in our school district about student achievement and about redistricting. And I was engaged in that because my school was one of the schools that they were looking at. And I just really wanted to see that our board and our district committed to achievement for all students. And so that's the reason I ran. And that kind of leads me to what some of my most meaningful moments would be. I think some of the most meaningful work has been really digging in on student achievement and better understanding the kinds of actions that boards and districts need to take to ensure that students who are behind have accelerated growth so that they're able to catch up. So when I first started on the board, it was right during the time period that the park was coming in as our assessment. It was replacing the ISAT. And so we did not have data from park for a couple of years because we had only ISAT data and that didn't compare. And so we were looking towards being able to judge the impact of our actions on the student growth trajectory. And once we had enough data, we realized that our efforts weren't adequate enough. And so the superintendent and the board worked together to set some goals, and we made a huge investment. We hired 19 staff members to look at that and to look at, in particular, look at growth equitably. So looking at the schools, not every school in the district, the schools that had students who really were in need of growth, that's where that investment was made. And so going forward from that, watching their scores increase was amazing. I mean, it's really, ISB teaches school boards that they can make a difference on achievement. And that was when that happened, and that was the most meaningful thing. So it's a great reminder when we're doing the work that we do, the self-evaluations with boards, the training with boards, all those kinds of things, how much it matters, because it actually does move the needle for students when boards and districts are doing their work. So that's definitely the most meaningful initiative that I was involved in, but there was lots of meaningful moments. I couldn't even tell you all of them. I loved being a board member. It was a joy.
That's awesome to hear, and really cool example of being able to point at something and say, like, this is some place where decisions we made as a board made a significant impact and difference in these students' lives and their ability to perform at school. And so that's just got to feel really, really good to see that and know that they're really succeeding because of some changes there.
Right.
Thinking more about now, how would you say that your experience as a former school board member influences your work right now?
In every way. You know, as I've come in, and I've only been here, I think this is my 4th week, but I have such an appreciation for every department at ISB because I understand the meaning for school board members. So the press updates, those are amazing. I don't know what we would do if we didn't have that, to keep our policy manuals up to date. The self-evaluations, so important. The trainings, the joining of conference. I mean, I was an active participant in every area that ISB works. We didn't have a superintendent search, so I didn't do that. But in almost every area, I was really involved. And so I believe in the value. And in terms of my federal advocacy work, I used to be a congressional staffer. So I know the value of school board voices to a staff member. And that's why it's so exciting to be able to help school board members build relationships and share their perspective with their legislators and their legislative staff, because I've been in both roles and I understand, that really meaningful collaboration and how much value that has.
I'm so glad you brought up the federal advocacy background, because it positions you very uniquely to have, like you said, be on both sides of the table, so to speak. You've been a board member and you've also been able to see things kind of in real time at the federal level. And so that translates to a very unique perspective when it comes to getting board members to engage with advocacy. And so my follow-up question to that would be, why is it so important for local boards to engage in advocacy in general?
I think that members and staff really care about the impact of their decisions at the local level. And school board members and school leaders, the superintendents included, they're the ones that can share that. So a piece of legislation that's coming through, a funding level that's altered, all those kinds of things, members and staff, the part that they're there to represent is that local impact. And so they have to hear it. They have to know it. And that's why it's so important for us to, share our stories and our perspective with our leaders.
Yeah, and the storytelling. I said that in some previous episodes with other governmental relations staff, and they've emphasized the importance of getting board members to share their stories with legislators, because if they don't, some legislators kind of miss a big chunk of the context when it comes to how something might affect their school board. And so it's critical. If no one's telling them how something will affect their community, their students, their district, I mean, they may not ever hear how it will affect it until it might be too late.
And I will say this as well. Education has always been something that both parties support. There's people, no one is against education. They want their students to succeed. And so that's a real opportunity, regardless of a member's party, regardless of their perspective. They really care about students. They want students to do well. That's like a universal goal. And there may be disagreements in terms of how and what's best, but I think it's an opportunity to really build on a shared, value that our legislators and our school board members believe in and have dedicated their time toward. And so I think it's a great area to expand perspective. We might hear things that we don't really understand how they translate. And school board members can help to translate. Here's what we mean by professional education for our educators. Here's what we're doing with that. Here's what we mean by social and emotional learning. Those are both touch points where you might hear kind of more rhetoric that doesn't make sense at the federal level potentially, but to hear about it from your local school and how it works in your local school, it makes a difference. And it helps to be all on the same page, where we all understand kind of what we're working toward and what we believe the value is and how we can work together to continue to see students improve.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the importance of kind of ignoring which side of the political spectrum someone falls on. I mean, send your message to anyone, any of your state legislators, even if they don't necessarily align with your political opinions, just because it's the kids, and everyone wants to see kids succeed, regardless of where you are, like you said. And it's such an easy win for legislators, of course, and they want those easy wins. So I'm sure that telling them how things will affect you for good or better for worse will definitely impact the way that they vote over at the Capitol. So thinking more about just kind of broadly advocacy in general, can you share like an example of where advocacy, either from when you were serving as a school board member or something maybe you saw during your time serving at the federal level from a school board in Illinois that made a tangible impact at the federal level?
I will give you a recent example that I think is important. So we believe at ISB and in our local boards, we're public educators, right? So we believe in the value of public education. We also understand how tight the resources are for schools. And so looking at the federal role, we're very protective of those federal funds, regardless of whether or not they make up the majority of our funds, which they don't. They're an important part. They're a part that we couldn't do without, right? So we're really working to support that federal contribution. And I think that's where the dialogue about, federal funds going towards private schools matters, because looking long term, as the federal government spends its very limited resources on education, the more that an investment in private schools would make up part of the federal budget, the more pressure that might put on the contribution that's helping to fund public schools. So there had been a provision in the budget reconciliation legislation that established for the first time a federal tax credit for contributions to scholarship granting entities for private schools. So organizations that fund scholarships to private schools, if you contributed to those organizations, you would get a tax credit. And the tax credit was unlimited, regardless of your income level. The limit was 10% of your adjusted gross income. So you could donate a significant amount and get that credit. And that would be an enormous amount of federal dollars as we go forward, right? So that was something we were concerned about. Concerned about the idea that we would be taking federal funds and funding private schools, which aren't regulated by the federal government, et cetera, but also the pressure that then puts on our federal budgets. And so the legislation continued forward. There was really very little change through the House and the Senate provisions. However, when it got to that final Senate action, I think the voices of educators and others expressing concerns about that made a difference. Because when the provision finally went through, it was limited to $1,700 per person. So not unlimited to that 10% of AGI, but only $1,700. And it was also limited to states where the leadership of the state felt like this is the direction that they wanted to go. So a state would have to elect to participate in this program, and then they would align and say, okay, here's the organizations that you can contribute to. We're going to put a list of them together. We're going to certify them. And so that just makes a difference in the scope of what that potential program will be and the contribution that will end up being a part of our federal budget. Yes, it's still a federal tax credit for private education for the first time, but it's more limited. And so, in my opinion, the voices of our school boards, our superintendents, our teachers, our other advocates for public education made a difference in saying, gosh, we have really limited dollars. Let's be sure that we do a good job funding our federal obligation towards public education first. And then, as we consider other aspects, do that in acknowledgement of the state's role. So allowing in a state where that isn't the direction that our state would want to go in, like ours, allowing that state decision to have some prominence as we look at that federal contribution and how it's going to play out in our own states. So I think that was an area where people were really concerned about this new provision, and their voices made a difference. And I think sometimes we feel right now like it's all determined. They're going to go what they're going to do no matter what. But that wasn't true in this case. It looked like it might have been true. Like the first actual provisions on the House and Senate looked very similar, and it didn't look as if there had been an impact from the concerns that were raised. But in the final calculation, there was a big change. And so I think it just highlights how important it is when we have concerns to share them, because they may be effective in promoting change.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point where it sounded like at certain points, it sounded like the legislation really wasn't going to change. And that's just how it was going to be. But knowing that the voices and the issues and concerns raised as a result still did make a difference. That kind of leads me actually into my next question, which is, what are some common misconceptions that school board members might have about engaging with legislators or in the advocacy process?
I think there's one, that's one that a big one we just hit on, which is that
Yeah.
it's polarized, it's brought down from on high, what's going to happen, and it won't make a difference if we share our perspective. And I think that that's really important to debunk that, because it's not true. Certainly at times, those kinds of things, you raise your voice, you share, you tell your story, and it doesn't make a difference. That's going to happen. But there are times where the advocacy of passionate people who care can really be heard. I'll give you an example of that.
Sure.
One of the areas that I also advocate is cancer research. I do that as a cause because my husband passed away with cancer. And so I have a long time of working with our legislators and staff to talk about the importance of this funding. And one of the meetings that I attended was probably about 7 years ago, maybe. It was with appropriations staff, and it was with numerous people who actually had stomach cancer, which is the cancer that we lobby for. And it was with them and the congressional appropriations staff. And there was some, wonderful doctors that were researchers and clinicians, and then patients, a few family members, which was my situation. My husband had already passed away. But we sat in this room and we all shared our stories. And we got our funding. I'll tell you that.
Nice.
We got our funding for years afterwards. So it was effective. But also, the staff reached out to the organizer of the meeting and said it was the most meaningful meeting that they had had in their time on the Hill. And I think that that's the kind of thing that we forget. The stories that we share are important. They're meaningful. The staff are impacted by these stories, and it makes a difference. And so that's one of my favorite stories, because it really shows the importance of our voices. And on the staff side, shows the difference that a staff member can make, and that's the thing. A lot of decisions are controlled in Washington by staff members too, but each are important. And, really connecting and building that relationship and sharing that story makes a difference to the staff member, to the member, and to the school, because it can change. It can change their trajectory of the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, really, reaching out to a legislator is just a form of networking, if you want to think of it that way. It's just establishing those connections. And I mean, if you do it frequently and consistently enough, I'm sure that they'll get to know you and your district, and that can probably form an even stronger bond and help that relationship even more. It might even feel a bit daunting as a school board member to know that, my legislator is listening to me. That maybe that feels a little bit more like scary. And so, I mean, maybe for newer or hesitant board members who want to pursue that, but maybe are just a little bit shying away from it, what advice would you give to help them feel more confident and emboldened or empowered in their advocacy efforts?
Well, I'm really excited that I'm here to be a part of that, because I think sometimes it's just not knowing. And I think that's one area where ISB can really be impactful, is just helping school board members to know what to expect, that kind of thing. Like, here's how it's going to go. Here's what your role is going to be. Like, when we're having a meeting, we bring a lot of school board members out to the COSBA conference, the COSBA Advocacy Conference in September. Part of the role that ISB plays is just helping to make it a little more familiar so that it's not so unfamiliar. And whether you're at that conference or whether you're doing advocacy by email or whether you're doing a phone call or whether you're meeting in your district office, I think that's one of the great things that ISB offers to our school board members, is that they can make it a little bit more familiar and give them a little bit more of what to expect so that it isn't so daunting. So that's one thing I would say, is reach out. When you're thinking about advocating, reach out, and we can really help to give you tips and help you to know what to expect, and that will give you a little bit more confidence. The other part that I would say is believe in the importance of your message. And that's the thing, like, that's kind of what we've been sharing. What the stories that we're telling, they matter. And so I think that's something to give you confidence. It's something staff want to hear. It's something members want to hear, something that matters. And what you're doing can make a difference. And all those things, I think, should give school board members, even if they're a little bit nervous at first, the confidence that what they're doing is the right thing and that it's an important effort to participate in.
Yeah, those are great points and great ways for board members just to feel a little bit more comfortable, confident in just the messaging that they're sharing and making sure that they're sharing what needs to be shared and getting it to the ears that need to hear it. Looking ahead, what would you say are some of the key legislative or policy issues that you think board members should be keeping an eye on for this coming year as an opportunity to reach out to their advocacy or to their, say, legislators or even at the federal level? I mean, I know right now it's kind of a loaded question because it seems like it changes every single day.
Well, for sure. I think on the state side, I know that our ISB government affairs staff have been keeping school board members aware of the very busy legislative session and all the action that takes place there because those legislators are very busy. I think on the federal side, it's kind of unprecedented to have so much federal activity, and that's why I'm here. That's why ISB really invested in ensuring that we're going to have our federal advocacy team strong and that our voices are going to be heard federally because there's just so much activity. It used to be that you could kind of take for granted that federal contribution was going to just continue to be there. Maybe it didn't increase as much as we'd want, but it was generally, supported. That's just not the case the past couple of years. There's been just more dialogue about the continuance of the federal funds, about what to continue, about how to continue it. And so that's something that's really important this funding year for schools. And even looking retroactively, one of the things that we've been looking at is some funds that had already been allocated kind of being called back. So that's an area to look at. Last year's funds go towards this school year. I mean, it's a little bit of a delay how the federal government gets towards the school year. So those funds, and then looking forward in terms of the funds that are coming, those are really key issues for schools. The federal areas, Title I, all the titles of the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and then the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Those are really important funding streams for schools. And so looking at all of that. So that's a big focus. Another area is administrative actions. So this administration has been prolific in its administrative actions, and there's a potential significant impact for schools. So some of those things are working their way through the courts, some of the administrative actions and whether or not they'll stand. But for example, we had a important ruling from the Supreme Court, which said that these administrative actions and things that are being taken by this administration in terms of, the department and the continuing of the Department of Education, that they're going to proceed. So that means we have to really be watching exactly how that happens because it could have an enormous impact for schools. If some of the federal programs are transferred, for example, to another agency, or, in some cases, the staff are greatly reduced at the Department of Education. And so these are areas to really understand and advocate about because they have an impact on schools. They have an impact on students. They have an impact on parents. And so those are also areas that we're really looking at, those administrative actions. And then I also sort of mentioned it, but the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has made many decisions, some of which are about these administrative actions, but some of which are just, in education generally, that are potentially going to have an impact on schools, school districts, school boards, parents and students, the whole entire school community will be impacted by some of the decisions that are coming forward. So those are some of the big areas. Congress right now has focused less on that overarching policy. So we haven't seen the education committees, for example, revise the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or something like that. We haven't seen, they call that like the authorization legislation. We haven't seen much of that. It's really been, congressional action has really been centered around funding as opposed to actual legislative changes. But the exception to that is what they're doing on the tax side. So I mentioned like the tax credit that was established, that was new. So that's something where there was actual policy that went forward in this way. So we'll see if they take anything like that on. I think if they did, it would most likely be in looking at like that future forward education, sort of the workplace training, that kind of thing. So looking at some of the work that schools do to help prepare their students for the future, that's probably the most likely area that there would be any kind of legislative change in the near future.
Gotcha. Yeah, sounds like there's no shortage of things to talk to your legislator about at all. But I would say for board members too, if there's if they want to kind of sign their name to something that says we're going to be actively participating in advocacy efforts across the state, we have a great advocacy ambassador program that I highly recommend all board members check out who are interested, just to see what that's about and see if you want to be a bit more ingrained in just the goings on in the advocacy sector. So, but Kristen, really do appreciate you sharing your perspective and experiences and how you got to IASB and what we're planning on doing in the future. Has been really great and very insightful, and I think our board members are really going to appreciate this episode.
Thanks. This is great, and I look forward to working with them.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.